Welcome, everybody, to another episode of In the Clouds with AWS. Ryan's here with us again today. We've got a pretty interesting topic we're going to talk to you about. We're going to cover storage within AWS. You can see my screen that I've got up here. This is where we're going to focus our conversation, kind of understanding the different types of storage options that are out there from AWS, how those fit in from a migration standpoint. What is a benefit to infrastructure deployments, and overall some features and functionality that you may not be aware of or see a benefit for in your environment. Brian, I want to thank you for being with us again this week as we go through this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Sure. We've got multiple options now. Those of you that are not familiar with the cloud, there are native storage options within cloud providers that allow me to eliminate some services or take different utilization of those storage offerings as far as it's concerned within, sharing your VMs or doing database housing or migrations, DRs, or, just putting another drive to a server. So let's get into it. We've got our particular areas of storage, and I figure we'll just kind of step through them, Brian. First off, we got the simple storage, the S3. It sounds pretty explanatory there. It's simple storage. It's just what we're providing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Amazon S3, right? This is the OG of storage. And I think, what a lot of people, especially, in the middle part of the previous decade, as they were looking at what are some early cloud use cases, like cloud storage is what is one of the first things that comes to folks. And, probably, we go through kind of the history of S3 and why customers love it so much. I hesitate to like speak in superlatives or things like that, but I've heard people, third parties much smarter than me, describe it this way. So I'll describe it this way as well. This is basically infinite storage, right? For nearly every customer that's out there or that somebody that's considering this, AWS can really add disks to S3 faster than anybody can put data into it. So this is object-based storage, so different from the file and block technologies that we'll get into later. And as I said, was one of the original kind of AWS services. And this web available storage is great for so many different things. The classic use cases are, static media files to get that off of disk attached to a virtual machine. This is, massively redundant, 11 nines of durability in that case. So I think it's like, you got a better chance of winning the lottery and getting attacked by a shark and getting struck by lightning at the same time than AWS is gonna lose data that's been stored in S3. So it's globally accessible and also very secure storage as well. So that we've added a lot of features, bucket policies, object level policies. We've added endpoints inside of a virtual private cloud or the Amazon VPC, so that data that's stored in, would technically be considered the public space, the public zone of AWS, which is S3, can only be accessible from within the VPC. We put CloudFront as a content delivery network, a CloudFront distribution in front of that. We can create signed URLs. We can make CloudFront a trusted signer. And there are many customers that use S3 for its ability to host static websites as well. So, and then, speaking to the redundancy of it, the durability of it, the availability of it, and the security of it is, S3 is where your logs from AWS, your CloudTrail logs reside. And when we turn on CloudTrail log file integrity validation, we turn on object versioning inside of S3. We've made it so if anybody's attempting to tamper with our log files, we'll instantly know because once we change the metadata of the underlying data that's being stored, a new object is being created. So this is giving customers lots of great, fast, secure, highly available ways to store all different types of data.
So as far as integration, and I'm taking my approach from coming from a Microsoft side of the house, we have AD integration we could do from this, like an NTFS share or an NFS share or a CIF share using this storage.
So those are our file protocols, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And as we get into some of the other storage services, we'll talk about how we can integrate with Active Directory or other traditional more on-premises identity systems. But in many cases, and as we'll get into something like AWS Storage Gateway, S3 is being used as a back end for that. But authentication and authorization are happening through a different mechanism.
Gotcha.
And then lastly, about S3, one of the things that's made it so cost effective for customers, I think, it was 2 decades ago, really, that we were, an operational, functional, usable, tiered storage system in an on-premises environment was like the holy grail for a storage manager. And now we've got, your S3 standard. You've got S3 for infrequently accessed stuff. That's, maybe once a month. We've got S3 for just single AZ. So this is data that, I could easily recover or get from somewhere else if it got lost. And I can now activate intelligent tiering inside of S3 to move things from, the most performant, but still, but I'm paying a premium for that performance, all the way down into Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, is giving me lots and lots of management capabilities, really automated and managed as from the customer perspective on my behalf by Amazon, so that I don't have to worry about provisioning different types of disks. John, you probably remember, like, we'd have like a small thin layer of hopefully like some 200 gig SSD drives, and then some 10K SAS drives underneath that. And then if we're lucky, we got some 7,200 SATA drives beneath that. I don't have to worry about the management of that at all with S3 intelligent tiering and how it integrates with all the different versions of block storage that we have.
Okay, and then just obviously, of course, because it's simple storage, this is an offering that we see both in a commercial cloud at AWS and the Gov cloud as well. So it is something that both sides of the house can take care of.
100%. And by virtue of the fact that I would hope that everybody has CloudTrail logging turned on inside of their AWS account, I would venture a guess to say the percentage of AWS customers who are not using S3 in some capacity is near zero.
Gotcha. Well, again, like you said, and like it explains, it's a simple storage. So this is as plain Jane as we can get as far as storage is concerned with AWS. So we take a step up, and now we go into the Elastic File System, EFS, within AWS. So again, this is serverless storage that's out there. So, let's get into a little bit more data that we would handle within this type of arena.
So EFS is great for IT professionals, really, who are needing to manage a shared file system for Linux hosts. It's multi AZ from an availability perspective, and it integrates with services and features like AWS backup. So that I can protect that data. But this is great for file data that's going to live within my VPC that my Linux hosts need to use.
Gotcha. And for those of you who don't know, virtual private cloud, the reason I bring that up is I have a new customer we're talking to, and they're having a hard time with the terminology, getting that understanding. So I'd like to just clear it up. So this is more Linux driven type storage. So this is where we would see things from like a Red Hat, those types, Ubuntu types of storage models, not really from a Microsoft standpoint, correct?
Absolutely. But some of the advantages that I'm getting as a customer is I've got similar durability, 11 nines on my data, and up to 4 nines of availability as an SLA. I'm only paying for the storage that I use. And I do have the ability, similar to S3, to automatically move infrequently accessed files. And you'll hear me keep coming back to that, as I think one of the management headaches from an IT perspective for a long time has been whether it's users or somebody else saying, I can't delete that. I can never get rid of it. And meanwhile, it's a 40 meg PowerPoint presentation that hasn't been opened in 3 years. That's sitting on primary storage. So with EFS, I've got a serverless implementation that allows me to reduce costs up to 92% by automatically moving these infrequently accessed files. So it's a great way to quickly create and configure shared file systems for AWS compute services. I think probably the most common way I've seen this used would be on Amazon EC2. So our Elastic Compute Cloud, Linux virtual machines, but EFS can also function as a shared file system for our Elastic Container Service, ECS, our Elastic Kubernetes Service, EKS, as well as Amazon Fargate. And EFS also functions as a shared storage layer for many Lambda functions. So when serverless computing needs to go pull files from somewhere, EFS integrates with that greatly.
Gotcha. So I mean, this again, obviously, let's just handle the question here right up front, so we're not hitting on each one. But as far as all of the storage services that AWS provides, there's nothing out there that we can't get on the GovCloud side of the house, correct?
The best place to check on all of these things, and I'll share this with our listeners here, is there's a great place to go find the services in scope. And John, I'll send you that link if you want to pull this page up.
Sure.
But this is the best place for customers in every vertical to go check out what services are in scope for various compliance programs. And as this page loads up, we'll see just a few lines down FedRAMP, and we can go ahead and click that, because that's what we're talking about. Sorry, right in the chart in the middle there.
Oh, so there we go.
And if we scroll down, so here's where we can see FedRAMP moderate. So that's our commercial regions in the US, East and West. And then in the middle there, these are all of our services with a FedRAMP, a high authorization. And here's where you can see it's been totally approved. It's maybe going through the Joint Authorization Board review. It's maybe going through a third-party assessor, but this is where you can go find whether or not any of these services are available in the region that you're looking for.
Oh, that's great. So yeah, so we got in our storage right in here that we can get to. No, this is great. This is a great site. What I'll do is I'll make sure I add this into our description as well once we get this posted, so everybody can take a look for themselves.
But yeah, so far everything that we've discussed, S3 and EFS, yeah, definitely available in GovCloud.
Yeah, because and I mean, I know we're talking about storage, but just again, from an understanding of when we're talking about these different levels of cloud that are out there offered, we obviously have our commercial. Everything comes out in commercial. That's our bleeding, cutting edge technologies, disruptive solutions that are out there. And then we see a lag from that because of the approval process when it goes into that GovCloud, just because it's got to go through, their checks and balances before that service can be applied. So if you see something that's not there initially, it's typically on a roadmap when we're talking about cloud providers.
Yeah, we're working with our sponsoring agencies and our customers to try to get that all done. But I think for many of the things that we're talking about, and I know we're here to talk about storage, but one of the things that I've come across as a common misconception in the public sector is that because I am a government entity, I must use AWS GovCloud, and that's whether I'm a federal customer or state or local. And the fact of the matter is that what we should really be looking at is do I have some requirement to meet FedRAMP high baselines, which means a lot of things, but one of the things that differentiates FedRAMP high from everything else is that it's all US persons that are going to be supporting your environment, doing maintenance inside of the data center, whether that's physically inside of it or remotely. It's all U.S. persons. And what I found is that, like, I've had schools tell me that they think they need FedRAMP, they think they need to be in GovCloud because they're technically a public sector agency, and that's not the case. That's not what GovCloud is for. And conversely, if you are if you're a commercial entity, but you require ITAR compliance, or you believe that it's easier to manage your HIPAA compliance with FedRAMP high baselines, then AWS GovCloud can be the place for you.
Yeah, it's a good cross mesh between commercial companies and gov organizations that really you've got to define. And that's where my role comes into play when I'm working with my customers, is really defining what it is and where they need to fit into it. But we'll get off our soapbox here for a little bit for the GovCloud. I'm going to get back to storage. So the one that I'm interested in talking about is the FSX storage offering that's out there. So this is where we get into the Microsoft world, correct?
Yeah. So FSX comes in several different flavors. There's FSX for Lustre, which I know a lot of data scientists seem to like. There's FSS for OpenZFS, which is a really highly performant system for again Linux hosts. But Amazon FSX for Windows File Server opens up so many things that we can talk about that are just driving incredible value for customers. So FSX, FSX in its vanilla flavor, its vanilla format, we talked about as being Linux hosts, right? So this is CIFS, NFS, and I'm not really doing a lot of like Active Directory integration or anything like that. But as I'm getting into, and this is a great hybrid cloud use case as well, I have a need for a managed Windows file server that resides within the cloud, and it's going to start to give me some of the benefits that I'm looking for when I'm using Windows to manage my infrastructure. So we've got highly available storage for Windows applications with full SMB support. Because we've got data deduplication and compression built into it, customers are lowering their cost by nearly 60%. We can strengthen data protection with encryption. We've got file access auditing, and we've got automatic backups inside of it. So we're presenting a front-end Windows native file system integrated right with your Active Directory, so your permissions and everything are all going to flow through. I can set up as many Windows file shares as I would need on my system, and I can establish access permissions from there. And then I can connect to my file shares, whether I'm connecting perhaps over a VPN into my AWS virtual private cloud from a remote or branch office, whether I'm accessing these file shares from Windows servers because the servers need them, or maybe I'm using Amazon Workspaces for remote desktop or AppStream for streaming applications. I have a managed Windows file system behind me that's giving me it's completely native integration. There's no application that you're using or no server that you're running that is not going to look at this and think it's anything other than a Windows file system.
Yeah, so that really gets us into more of a content collaboration from a Microsoft side of the house, being able to provide these shares out there to be able to access it. Now, the other thing too is I know this is coming back to some of the stuff within my wheelhouse. This is one of the high recommendations from AWS, as well as some of the other EUC partners out there. If we're utilizing FS Logix, which is not to be confused, is profile management, persona management for users' persona. So we're decoupling that from the OS and we're putting that into shares. So this is that type of storage that we would do, because from a Windows perspective, we don't need to have that Windows front end. We don't have to have that file server compute sitting in our VPC that we've got up there. And then we also don't need to really do more than just provide that share and the actual drives themselves. It's a high performance side of the house, correct?
Yeah, so I've got consistent sub-millisecond latencies from within the cluster, capable of consistently delivering multiple gigabytes per second of throughput and hundreds of thousands of IOPS within a file system. and I can provide storage with FSX to all of my users and systems with file systems up to 64 terabyte per file system. And then if I do need to expand beyond that, I can use DFS namespaces to create a common namespace that would span multiple clusters that I could be creating.
Nice. And then I can expand this across multiple zones within AWS, correct? For
absolutely,
you know, I mean, for some resiliency and high availability of it.
So it's going to automatically replicate your data within an availability zone to protect it from component failure. But it offers multi-AZ deployment options as well. So that's going to give me to my data.
So now when we say we're eliminating that Windows file server, that traditional virtual machine that we would have, that would be our front end for translation, we do that AD permission set at the FSX dashboard panel within our tenant when we're making up these shares and everything. Is that correct? That's where we're doing some connectivity to our Active Directory to be able to pull those permissions that we need to do, or set those permissions that we need to on these different shares that we're providing, correct?
That's right. From within the console or the CLI or the SDK, I'll get all of the information that I need to join this cluster to my domain. But you know, as a managed Windows file server, it's I guess a shorthand way of putting is you can do everything with it that you could with a normal Windows file server, except for get into Server Manager and work within the OS, because we're managing the OS, we're patching it, you know, we're making sure it's available, we're providing that maintenance and that ongoing management for it, so that you just have a Windows file server cluster that you can connect to, right? That I think most customers is not within, you know, it's not within their core operating model. Like their own end customers don't derive value from how they manage their own Windows file systems. So this is another way of just shifting this undifferentiated management task stuff off to somebody who can do it at tremendous scale like AWS.
Well, and to a little shameless plug here, but our previous episode where we discussed about being able to, once we get migrated into the cloud, being able to eliminate some of that compute as we move along to grow that ROI in our cloud services. This is a perfect one that pretty much you could start right off the bat. I mean, you can, this can be planned in your migration and eliminate, you know, the licensing requirements you need from a Microsoft, that whole tax, the compute that you would have to. I mean, that is pulled off of the shoulders of your IT department. So, I mean, this is a good thing for people to take a look at. And I know, again, coming back to the EUC world, this is what was highly recommended as far as deployments when we're talking about that FS Logics store for our user personas. So, you know, I just want to make sure people are aware of, this is not just your typical, you know, this is the HR share, and this is where we're putting all of our, you know, PDF tax forms. This is everything across the board. And, oh, by the way, we have additional functionality to handle that high demand storage that we need in the environment for other things. So,
you know, we go through that typical, like, what are some things that I can do to reduce my storage cost type stuff? And FSX is really fitting the bill for a lot of things. I can use magnetic disk, or I can use solid state drives, which will help me optimize my cost based on the performance that I need. I'm only paying for the resources that I use. I don't have minimum commitments. There's no licensing costs. There's no upfront fees. I'm really just being billed by the hour for the file system, and then the storage capacity and the throughput capacity that I provision. We mentioned the data deduplication. So 30 to 50% savings for user documents, 70 to 80% for software development data sets. And then at the management level, as an administrator, I'm able to offer user quotas so I can monitor and control user level storage consumption, which of course is great in a remote desktop world and just a file share world as well.
And again, this is where you can start to monetize your IT department, because now with those quotas, you can do bill backs, you can do charges on that. So that again helps the technology department to be able to, this is where that cloud shifts at, you know, I'm just supporting the business from a technology standpoint. I'm a fire person responding to, you know, whatever the event is now. Now I can actually say, these services are monetized, and you're paying back for us as you expand it. So this really helps an organization to look differently at the cloud.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, that's a very good thing.
So there's one other aspect of FSX that we haven't really talked about. And last time we were talking about migrations, we were talking about when we're doing assessments correctly and we're understanding how many cores we're actually going to need, we can see a real significant reduction in our licensing costs. And many customers out there that are running Microsoft SQL workloads are faced with the choice of having a failover cluster, which from a licensing perspective is much more advantageous, or having these always on availability groups. The failover cluster within, let's say, if you take to that on-prem world within a single data center, is typically a little bit easier to manage because it's difficult for shared file systems to span across multiple data centers.
Yeah.
So where I might like to use that failover cluster to get that licensing advantage, I end up using SQL Server Enterprise and having these always on availability groups so that I can have continuous availability for my for SQL Server. But with FSX for Windows File Server as the shared storage layer for SQL Server instances running on EC2, I'm now creating a multi-AZ shared storage layer, which allows me to put my failover cluster in a different availability zone. And I'm seeing potentially a 50% reduction in my SQL Server licensing costs while getting the same very similar level of availability as SQL Server Enterprise. So I love and because of the native integration with Windows File Server and with SQL and with Windows Server in general, Microsoft is absolutely a first-class citizen on AWS. This is really simplifying database migrations into AWS.
No, that's great. I mean, again, that cost savings there, and we work with SQL a lot. So yeah, there's always trying to plan, and customers are always trying to evaluate from a licensing perspective. Do I go to the always availability group? Do I go to, just doing a mirror or a cluster? And it comes down to cost. So this is something that definitely is a cost savings, but you're still getting the advantages of that replication on the back end that you need for high availability.
Yeah, because FSX for Windows File Server supports continuously available file shares, I can provide highly available shared file storage to clusters across multiple availability zones, which is something that would be very, very difficult to manage in an on-prem world.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I want to go back here as well. Was there anything else in particular on the Windows side that you see that we should point out?
Not for the Windows side, but I definitely don't want to move on from FSX just yet because we haven't talked about FSX for NetApp ONTAP.
Yes, I'm very familiar with that one as well.
Yeah. So, I'm curious to know, how are you seeing FSX for ONTAP being used?
So we have a project that we work with one of our customers, and we did the ONTAP setup from their data center that they have. We had the replication going across to their tenant. We've put workloads to be able to expand across both that environment. It's worked so well for the customer that we're now putting in a direct connect. We're now expanding more server footprints into the environment, and they're now taking a look at that second phase of how do I increase that ROI by eliminating the front end on the Microsoft boxes. So they have their VMware cluster sitting in a data center. That's where we're doing our connection through ONTAP, and then we're doing that replication across the board from their on-prem into the cloud to where they're eventually going to move that transition to full operations within their AWS tenant.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great use case. We launched FSX for NetApp ONTAP about a year ago. It recently became generally available.
Yeah.
But with it, we can talk about like how much it scales up to, which is in this case file systems up to 176 petabytes, which is
Hmm.
probably more than your average bear is going to need. But you know, with FSX for Windows, I'm getting SMB, and with FSX for ONTAP, I have full native support for SMB, CIFS, and NFS. So I've got this multi-protocol storage where I'm getting all of the things that I would love about NetApp in an on-premises environment. As you know, it's rare, I think, that somebody would just set up a database and just never ever do anything with it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm storing some data. I'm probably going to want to do some things with it. And one of the great features of NetApp, or the FSX for NetApp ONTAP, and ONTAP in general, is this point in time cloning with Flex Clone. So I can clone my production storage, and the data is actually shared at the block level. So as long as that data hasn't changed, I haven't duplicated my storage. But when I make changes, I get that additional storage. So why would I want to do that? Well, maybe I've got some SQL queries that I want to run, and I want to make sure that it's not going to corrupt my data sets or do something I don't want it to do. So I can create this Flex Clone, run my queries against that, make sure that it's working, and then turn that back down. And in terms of my additional storage costs is almost nothing, because as long as I'm not changing data at the block level, that data is going to be stored. And with inline data compression, deduplication, the compaction, thin provisioning, and replication with SnapMirror, I'm saving a lot of money. And the other thing about the full support for SnapMirror is, wow, it's really making migrations much, much easier. So we're seeing this is like, I have to be careful about saying the most or the fastest or the whatever, but I can say safely, this is one of the most, if not the most fastest growing, most popular services since we launched Aurora, which is our managed RDS. So customers are loving this, and I'm so glad that AWS has this partnership with NetApp.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a great integration there, and it gives you the feel from, let's say, a VMware administrator within an organization. You get that same feel, so it's not that different from what some of the things that you're handling on-prem. But yeah, there is some huge benefits that we go within this. And, there's the advantages from that VMware side of the house to do this integrated migration. I mean, I know when we did our project, it was a complete handshake between the AWS team and the VMware team that we worked together on to get this product or this solution deployed for our customer and get it up and running for them. So it was a really good transition for the customer to where they now see that value moving forward. And again, allowing them to focus on getting that ROI. Where can I trim the fat on that infrastructure that I don't need anymore, that I had in my data center, that I can replace with other means in the cloud? And these are in the marketplace, of course, and these are different tiers. The FSX side of the house, because we're more focused, geared into this from the NetApp side of the house, and then also from the Microsoft side of the house. So it's a little bit different than what we're seeing from our basic block level type storage stuff. So that's something that you need to be aware of. Yeah, you may see a cost from this, but once you work out those breakdowns where somebody like us as a partner can help you, you can understand the cost savings over time.
And I can't stress enough just how critical taking a total cost of ownership view to that is. Because I think that some people look at like the AWS price calculators or doing some sort of cost estimation, and what they kind of have perhaps a blind spot to is how much of your time, person hours per month, are being devoted towards maintenance, backups,
definitely,
patching, all these things. Whereas with FSX for NetApp ONTAP, and especially like in a SQL environment, I continue to get the benefits of this continuously available file system. I can use failover clusters instead of AGs, and the MPIO failover policy that's going to be on my Windows instances just looks at two different elastic network interfaces that we put on this shared storage layer of FSX for NetApp ONTAP, and make that an iSCSI target. And now I've got a preferred and a standby path to a shared storage layer that stretches across availability zones. I don't have to worry. I don't have to worry about setting things up to replicate the data on my own. I don't have to worry about setting things to configure backups. So, all of the stuff is natively integrated, and just the time savings. I think it's been known for quite some time that the longer customers are on AWS, the more money they save, and they begin to realize like these things that I'm doing manually are built in as automatic management features that I can set policies for that I revisit on a regular basis, but that I don't have to be there making clicks. And getting out of click ops, I think is one of the should be a primary goal for every customer who's getting into this space.
Sure. And then just to clarify, my use case where I was discussing the migration from on-prem to cloud, that necessarily is not what you have to do as far as the FSX for ONTAP. It's really that ONTAP methodology that we have offered from NetApp on-prem is now living in your cloud. I mean, I just want to make sure that everybody's clear of that one.
Believe it or not, we've got one more thing to talk about with FSX.
Sure.
And I hopefully folks I have at least have heard of before the AWS Storage Gateway. AWS Storage Gateway is either it can be ordered through the console as a physical appliance, but it's more commonly deployed as a virtual machine, and we make the images available, for Hyper-V, for KVM, for VMware, obviously, and of course you can even run it as an EC2 instance. So we can talk about those use cases. But this is a great for low latency access from remote office, branch office, wherever you are, to the most commonly accessed files and data, with backups and cold data being automatically tiered into S3. So this is an area where I was talking about where we've got a front end to data that ultimately lives in S3. So the storage gateway can be configured as a file server, can be configured as just basically an iSCSI target in what we call both block and volume gateways, which are moving snapshots and things like that into S3. And then for those of us who are still looking at we're getting tape replacements or upgrading our VTL libraries, as a tape library, the storage gateway functions can function as a target for Acronis and Veeam and everything else. And then I'm taking my tapes and moving them directly into Glacier, which is just a phenomenal cost savings. But now I can put Amazon FSX for Windows File Server on the storage gateway service. So now instead of creating it as that file server that I then put a Windows server in front of, I've got all of that managed natively inside of the appliance and inside of AWS. So my SMB clients are safely connecting to file systems that live both, within my VPC or are cached locally on my storage gateway device. And all of that data is replicated and protected inside of AWS S3. Where I can turn on all those things like versioning and delete protection and automatic tiering and all that stuff.
So, and that as a virtual appliance, I mean, I'm sure that has a minimal footprint as far as requirements it would need, which type of instance would be needed to run that as that appliance. So yeah, I mean, that's phenomenal. It's again, this is looking at those cost savings, but also giving a high availability. Now, when you brought up the latency for these branches coming into these types of shares, are we looking at a caching or something along for that, or is it just throttling its access to the shares?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So with FSX for File Gateway, I'm seamlessly accessing Windows native SMB capabilities of FSX for Windows File Server, and that's giving me NTFS and Active Directory integration and data deduplication and all that great stuff. Where I configure it as a File Gateway, and as the administrator, I can either pin certain things locally or allow the logic of the application to make this determination. But generally speaking, what's happening is recently written files or commonly accessed files are cached locally on the appliance, whereas data that has not been accessed for a while or has crossed a certain threshold in terms of my capacity is moved off into S3. Now, as the end user, whether that's Dave in accounts receivable or Linda in marketing or whomever that may be, they're just, they're accessing their files probably through Windows File Explorer on their PC, the same way they always would. And they have, this is, the IT manager's dream is no disruption to user workflows, right? No questions about who moved my buttons or anything like that. I'm opening up my files the same way I normally would. And the only difference between, opening a file that's cached locally on the appliance versus opening a file that's in AWS is maybe a few seconds of load time as I'm bringing something up. And, typically people aren't opening CSVs with 5 million records inside of them. So I think your standard Excel file is going to load within 5 to 10 seconds. And that's typically, not something that a user would complain about.
No, definitely. I mean, again, with my background, it's all about user productivity and user performance experience. So yeah, that's definitely something that we would want to see, especially when there's when you're dealing with those remote offices, those ones, and we've got a lot of those where they're out in the backwoods, and it's a very slow connection. So having that ability to help enhance that for the user, that's phenomenal. That is really great. Now, as far as that gateway that's handling everything from the FSX side of the house for the storage, correct? Or are we able to use that gateway across all storage platforms?
So I'd have my gateway in like any school, any branch office, anything like that, and I have centralized storage inside of AWS. I'm, maybe as like a VMware administrator, I'm doing some work on that ESX host, but primarily I'm accessing and managing this through Windows Server Manager 9 times out of 10. So it's, I wouldn't expect even any disruption to something that the help desk or, level 1 administrator in a facility would be doing.
Oh, that's great. It's great. So let's hit real quickly on top of the Lustre and the Open ZFS side of the house, just for those that are listening that would be interested in something along these lines. These, you said the Lustre were focused on the Linux side, correct?
Yeah, this is where I have to be careful because I don't want to get out of my depth
Gotcha.
for both ZFX and Lustre. Lustre is cloud file storage. It's integrated directly with S3. I would say like folks who are using Lustre know that they need it, kind of thing. It's but this is great for high performance computing. It's great for big data analytics. It's great for machine learning and machine learning training models, and for folks that are doing a lot of work with large media files, so visual effects and rendering and transcoding. They will have it's a model that allows me to scale my storage with my compute and integrate with machine learning and artificial intelligence services from AWS like SageMaker, and work on media stuff with services like Nimble Studio from AWS. And we've got customers like the Toyota Research Institute, Maxar, Netflix, and Rivian that are using this. I would say that I've not run into a lot of K-12 schools or organizations with 500 users that are really getting into this, but data, as we know, is getting bigger all the time. Yep. And eventually everybody's going to be doing something with machine learning. Maybe not everybody will be doing something with high performance compute or media rendering, but this is really high performance for Lustre file systems.
Yeah. And like you said, if typically when we're working with somebody, if they come in and say this, they have the demand for it. If they're not asking for it, that's where we're evaluating other storages, because that demand is not going to fit that user base. And then from the Open ZFS side of the house, I know you said earlier that was more of a higher performance. Is that correct?
So it is high performance. It's definitely Linux native. Open ZFS is an open source project of a native port of ZFS, the ZFS file system, to Linux, and ZFS as a standard includes functionality of both traditional file systems and a volume manager. So for folks that are deep into Linux development, and this even goes all the way back to folks who maybe we'll have to dust off this term, folks who are familiar with Solaris systems, eventually fell in love with ZFS, and ZFS was Open ZFS is the port of that to Linux. And so for workloads and machines that need POSIX workloads, NFSv4, it allows me to do access control lists. So there's a lot of security thing. I get for folks that like are working with like really large files, especially here, because it does support natively a maximum file size of like 16 exabytes. So big stuff. I think similar to Lustre, like for folks that have maximum file size of 16 exabytes appeals to them, they'll definitely want to take a look at this.
Yeah, you brought up Solaris. That brings me nightmares from back in the day. We're used to work with a SaaS-based organization where we provide services. We were heavy on the Solaris backend, so I knew we used ZFS. We had the Microsoft integration on the front end. So yeah, I mean, the other thing too. Again, I ramble so much, but bear with me. When we're talking about some of these things of looking at cost savings later on down the road, I've seen a lot of organizations take a look at the Linux side of the house to replace services that Microsoft has done for them before, to be able to do cost savings, because I can run a Linux-based instance and still provide Microsoft level services to my desktops, to my other servers in the environment, bring off some of those services to, an open operating system, and you don't have that cost. So that is something to, be aware of, because ZFS can help you out with some heavy lifting and some trickery to be able to do and replace a Microsoft side of the house, but do the same thing.
Yeah, so I think maybe in a future conversation, we should talk about some of the things that Amazon is doing to help customers modernize workloads and reduce their costs.
Definitely.
And certainly OpenZFS is one of those areas, because I don't know if we talked last time about Graviton processors, but the AWS specific chip that we make, which is for Linux workloads, is great for organizations that are pursuing sustainability goals, because its power consumption is so much lower than traditional x86 architecture. And because of the performance of the Graviton processors, I can get an OpenZFS cluster that scales up to 1 million IOPS with latencies of just a few hundred milliseconds for really high performance workloads. So if you're looking to migrate your on-premises data that's stored in a ZFS or other Linux-based file server to AWS, this is great, because it's giving me the same data management capabilities, and I don't have to update or modify existing code or how I'm managing that data. And I've got these rich capabilities within the cluster that make it easier for me to test and develop and run these cloud native applications. So we're seeing customers that are doing front-end electronic design automation, genomic research, again, media processing, but it's great for code and artifact repositories, DevOps solutions, and of course, big data and analytics. So OpenZFS does support a wide range of Linux, Windows, and Mac OS workloads. But I think, again, this is the case of if you're using ZFS and you know that you need it, this is a great place to look. And, if you're managing traditional Windows file shares and that's working well for you, and you're not doing a wholesale, migration of everything that you're doing on Windows into Linux or something open source, there's no reason that we need to be investing in making those changes.
Yeah,
no, this is not a place to store Word and Excel and Office documents.
Exactly. and I made a note here that we'll cover that as a topic in the future, and maybe we can get some more resources involved on your side of the house and have a deeper discussion around that. So definitely that'll be something that we'll line up later on in the future. So now we're shifting from the FSX side of the house. Let's go back to where we were. Oh, come on, John. There we go. And now and again, the understanding we're broken down into different sections here. So this is our object file, block storage type stuff. So once we go from the FSX, now we're looking at this elastic block storage, the EBS. So give us a quick rundown of that one. It's a high performance, but what kind of use cases are we seeing with this?
Yeah. So although I can do things like store structured data in CSVs or Parquet files or something like that in S3 and query that with Athena, that allows me to run SQL queries against files, even compressed files that are being stored in S3, that's typically not going to give me the kind of sub-millisecond latency performance that I really need in a database. And it's not the kind of place that we would store, we wouldn't have an operating system in S3. We may, when we snapshot a volume, which is an EBS volume that gets stored in S3, but we're not running the block-based storage for a virtual machine inside of S3. We want those disks attached directly to the host, whether that's Windows or Linux. So the elastic block store are our volumes that we're going to attach to our virtual machines. And it's typically not a great idea to store data that is non-recoverable data in the instant store of the machine, because that's one of the things to remember there is that's really ephemeral. So if the instance is needs to be terminated or something like that, I'm going to lose that data. But elastic block storage is persistent, and that allows me to do things like detach a volume from an instance, launch it with a new image, and reattach my data volumes to it. So I can use EBS for my root volumes. I use EBS for my data volumes. And with the somewhat recently announced Amazon GP3, I can scale my IOPS to 16,000 IOPS and up to 1,000 megabytes of throughput.
So this is something we would look for when we're doing a high computational type dig through data or pull through data.
Yeah, when I kind of go through my flowchart of where should stuff live, like for a database, for example, I would want to say I want that in Amazon's managed relational database service, whether that's for MySQL, PostgreSQL, MariaDB, Oracle DB, or SQL, a handful of others. Because I'm going to the cloud not just for the infrastructure management, but also for like some of that undifferentiated heavy lifting that we talked about. But if for some reason I've got workloads that can't go into a managed database service, then I'm going to be running my databases on EC2 instances. And so the data that's stored, the databases themselves is going to be stored on EBS volumes. Now, pretty much every virtual machine that's running, whether it's a database or not, is going to have some level of EBS storage, because I may have some low latency requirements where I do want to keep that data attached directly to the volume, but I may not always need 16,000 IOPS and 1,000 megabytes per second of throughput. So EBS volumes come in a bunch of different flavors. There are 3 different types of SSD volumes and a couple different types of magnetic disk HDD volumes. So depending on the kind of performance that I need, I can attach that to the volume. Now, from a cost savings perspective, one thing to keep in mind, and where I encourage IT administrators and folks making these kinds of decisions of where is my data actually going to live, important for customers to keep in mind that if I provision a 500 gigabyte EBS volume, I'm paying for all 500 gigabytes, whether or not I'm consuming that capacity. Whereas with S3 and EFS and FSX, I'm not really provisioning anything in advance, so I'm only paying for what I use. So as we look to modernize and drive cost savings, I think over time we'll see only that data that needs to live on an EBS volume there, and try to leverage something like the advantages that I get from something, for example, like FSX for ONTAP, where I can thinly provision things and not have to pay for zeros that I'm writing across a disk and not using.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because that's another thing a lot of customers I find don't quite understand, and obviously even some fellow technologists don't understand, is that yes, you're going to have that cost savings on the cloud side of the house. You'll be able to handle the compute a little bit better, but when it comes to storage, typically we're always going to have that storage cost. So from an EBS standpoint, whatever I'm provisioning out there, I'm always paying for it, whether I'm using it or not. So I need to be aware of that.
Yeah, for the data that resides on those volumes, the rule of thumb there is really kind of like it's the data that server and only that server is going to need.
Yeah.
If I have the ability, if I have the need or the ability to have multiple clients connect to something that needs to be shared storage,
Hmm.
something like EFX or FSX, which is built on top of EFS, just isn't that native Linux file system. It's the other flavors that we talked about.
Hmm.
The managed shared storage system is going to reduce my operational costs and give me much better performance. And I'm not just provisioning a server for the sole purpose of making something shared, when there are services built for shared storage, that are a better fit. And that's a rule that applies across, everything that we do at AWS, whether that's the type of database that we're using, whether database languages, database applications. It's all about the right tool for the right job.
Hmm. That definitely. Now, I know we're going to be coming up on time here, so I don't know. Maybe we follow up with a part 2 to cover some of this other stuff, because I think there's value in talking about the data migration, hybrid storage, managed file transfer, and the list keeps going, everybody. But I think we're good breaking in here on this. We'll call this part 1. We'll follow up with a part 2 in our next recording, where we'll go into a little bit deeper. But I think this is good for people to understand how the storage breakdown happens for them. Now, another question is as far as when I'm deploying an instance of, let's say, a Windows box, virtual machine up in my cloud in AWS, what level of storage am I using for that?
So,
just the OS side.
The typical, in the console, I'm going to provision a server with probably a relatively small root volume, 8 gigabytes, 20 gigabytes kind of thing. This is where my actual OS is going to be installed. And I may have some ephemeral storage attached to the instance. And that's really suitable from a Windows perspective. That's suitable for pagefile.sys and nothing else.
Yeah.
And then if I do need additional data volumes, either at the time of provisioning that instance or at some point in the future, I can create and attach additional volumes and just mount them from within the Windows file system. So within Windows Server Manager.
So the operating system itself, it's living within the instance, but the type of storage level or the storage that's being provided in the back end to house that's all just provisioned when I deploy the virtual machine, correct?
Yeah, that's a virtual disk that's attached directly to the instance.
Yeah, I bring that up because there are other cloud solutions out there where I need to provision my storage first and then put my machine in that storage. So that's why I'm just trying to make sure that everybody understands when I'm at AWS, I'm pulling out that instance, it's carved out for me. The storage now comes into play in those peripheral connections I do. And again, this is from a Microsoft side of the house, so just letting everybody know. Typically, we have a lot of Microsoft people, and we can get them converted as we go along. But just wanted people to understand that I'm provisioning the machine, and then I'm applying the storage. And I have the options here of my block level storage that I can add into that machine, but it's separate entities from each other.
And that's giving customers a lot of agility, right? Whether that's creating an instance for the sole purpose of making it a template VM, what we would call an Amazon machine image inside of AWS. So I can create an instance, image it, snapshot it, image it, convert it into a machine image that I'm going to use for my auto scaling groups, or just I'm creating some organization wide standards of, hey, when we do a Windows server, this is what it's supposed to be pre-configured to look like, and that's going to reduce my deployment times and help me enforce better governance standards across the organization. But yeah, having the VM and the block storage itself separate is giving me a lot of agility, because that data persists as long as I want it to, whether or not I actually even have the VM provisioned or running or anything like that.
No, that's great. I mean, again, I just wanted to make sure people understood that, because it is a different approach than some other providers that are out there. So to me, I think that's a huge advantage, but we'll let that rest with the listener's decision on their own end. So again, Brian, I appreciate it. This has been great. We'll definitely call this part 1. I do want to follow up so we can cover some more of this, because I do think there's some value add in these other storage provisions that we can use within AWS to provide to the customers. So again, thanks, man.
Yeah. We covered the basics. We covered block, we covered file. We spent a lot of time on file, but
Yeah.
there's probably even more time that we could spend on EFS. But and so we covered block, we covered file, we covered object. As we get into data sync and the Snow family and some of these other like managed storage services, or there's a lot that we can talk about from the Snow family perspective of moving data into AWS at terabyte scale or at petabyte scale. There's compute built inside of these actual boxes that we send out that can help with encryption and compression, and then on the AWS side, the rehydrating and decrypting that data for getting it up into AWS. I'd love to share with you a story about how we put a snow cone on the International Space Station. That's our small little ruggedized edge computing appliance. There's so many things that we can talk about that play. It's all ties together, right? Because that all ties into what we talked about a couple of weeks ago with migration. So lots to look forward to as far as what we're going to discuss. And these are always so much fun. So I appreciate you having me.
Sure thing. And yeah, great tease. So again, conclusion of part 1, part 2 to come. So look forward to it. And thanks for listening with us today. We'll look forward for you to be with us on our next episode.
Thank you, Jon.